Welcome to Around the Empire, the show that takes you around the U.S. Empire. I'm your host, Dan Wright.
I'm your host, Joanne Leon.
And on today's show, we talk about the greater wars in the Middle East continuing and expanding. Saudi citizens have been told to leave Lebanon. Is Lebanon the next battlefield in the war? Let's start with Prime Minister, maybe not Prime Minister, Mr. Hariri, who apparently resigned. We'll talk about the possibly upcoming war in Lebanon and what that would mean for this still Cold War between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and I guess Israel. So this past week and a half, the Prime Minister of Lebanon, Saad Hariri, resigned suddenly. He was essentially summoned to Saudi Arabia. He went without his, staff, and in a maneuver that went down, he later resigned. As of this taping, I believe he's still in Saudi Arabia, not back in Lebanon. After that happened, now I should say this. The reason he resigned, he said, was he was afraid of being assassinated. It's not clear. I guess he kind of pointed the finger at Iran and Hezbollah. In response to his resignation, Nasrallah of Hezbollah put out a statement saying that, he didn't take the bait, I guess, and sort of basically said that we don't know what's going on with Hariri and, everyone stand down. And so, Joanne, right now, this is, for what people are reporting, if you look at the BBC or the mainstream press, this is a prelude to some kind of war in Lebanon or a Saudi-Iranian war, but I don't really know. I think there's still some things that are unclear exactly what happened here, and is the Prime Minister coming home?
Yeah. So the timeline is that on November 3rd, the Prime Minister of Lebanon, Saad Hariri, he met with a foreign policy advisor to the Iranian Ayatollah. And the next day, I guess the same advisor had some talks with Bashar al-Assad in Damascus. And Assad came out with some kind of a statement like, I'm still going to, I don't accept a partition of the country, and the Syrian army and its allies are going to retake all of the Syrian territory. And I believe he also said that they were going to march on Raqqa. So whether or not the advisor talked to Hariri about the same thing, I'm not sure, but it seems kind of likely. And right after that meeting, appears to be the triggering event as to why the Saudis summoned him back. And he didn't resign, of course, until he was in Saudi Arabia. And the police in Lebanon, I think the military as well, they investigated and didn't find any evidence of a plan or an attempt on assassination. So they disagreed with that. And also the Lebanese government said, we don't accept this resignation until this prime minister stands in his own country and resigns. Until then, the Lebanese government is intact.
Wait, is he still the prime minister? Is he still technically the prime minister?
Yeah, they didn't accept the resignation. And I think there's some elections coming up too, which I didn't even get into that part of it. But so that was November 4th, I believe. And the same day, also something else about Hariri. He is Saudi himself. He's dual citizen. His business, a lucrative business, went bankrupt back in the summer.
Speaking of his business, or part of his business, his father was assassinated when he was the prime minister, and he was a billionaire. And you don't become a billionaire in the Middle East typically by innovation and hard work. You typically are very corrupt. So if he did in fact go bankrupt or had some business problems, he really destroyed an empire, because his father was like the richest man, or one of the richest men in Lebanon. Before he was killed. That's the one thing I kind of knew about him, that his father had been assassinated. So when he said he's afraid of assassination, it's like, well, that makes sense.
It seemed reasonable.
Dad was assassinated. But on the one hand, it's so strange, but on the one other hand, it's so obvious that Saudi Arabia has essentially kidnapped this guy and forced him to resign. The question is, why? And if the point was to provoke Hezbollah into an overreaction, it looks like Nasrallah didn't take the bait. It looks like he basically just kind of said, well, I'm not going to, launch troops or anything. I'm just going to wait it out. And it looks like Saudis underestimated how much this would irritate Sunni and moderate people within Lebanon, who, as much as they may not like the Shia militias, as much as they may be antagonistic towards Iran and Syria, or at least the Assad government, what remains of it, they don't like the fact that the Saudis essentially, kidnapped their prime minister and forced him to resign. They basically treated Lebanon the way they've been treating Qatar.
And they might recognize it as an attempt to destabilize. And I heard one person say that the Saudis felt that Hariri was too cooperative with Hezbollah and others who they see as enemies. But yeah, so
that's the same thing that took out Qatar, right? Anybody who gets close to Iran now, even within wasn't that the charges against Qatar that they were hosting? They were hosting Iranians. They were trying to get on better terms with Iran, and that's what started this. Trying
to do business with them, just too cozy with them. Yeah, for sure. That's what they said. But so then, sort of at the same time that this guy's resigning, Mohammed bin Salman, the young prince, I call him Prince Reckless. He's technically the crown prince. But now the rumors are that that his father's going to abdicate and he's going to take the crown soon. But so, while this is all happening, Prince Reckless is rounding up people all over Saudi Arabia. And we're talking about other members of the royal family, princes, some clerics, businessmen.
Right.
And nobody...
I'm very confused by this. I don't know. I know you've been following this closer than me, but this seemed to come out of nowhere for me, that they actually grabbed members of the royal family, are now under arrest. Some have been killed in, I would say, suspicious circumstances, to put it lightly.
Right.
This is a major palace coup, I guess is the word for it, in the literal sense of a palace coup. I guess this goes back to the succession of the Salman clan to the throne upon the death of the previous king. And now this is kind of, the way it was sold in the Western press, which was straight up embarrassing, by the way, was like, this is a reform movement or something. It was
a corruption crackdown. Do you want to hear how they're selling it? I have CNBC is a good place to watch interviews with Saudis, by the way. The foreign minister, Jubair, his name is, he's American or Western educated, so they put him out in front, He's not a royal technically, but he's their foreign minister. So to be fair to the Saudis, let's listen to what they say they're doing.
I think that this will increase investor confidence in Saudi Arabia, because it shows that we have adopted a zero-tolerance policy on corruption, just as we have adopted a zero-tolerance policy on terrorism and extremism and terror financing. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia announced, the custodian of two holy mosques announced more than 2.5 years ago that he will fight corruption and fight it robustly. His Royal Highness the Crown Prince has made it very clear that no prince and no minister and no high-ranking official is immune from corruption charges. The public prosecutor started an investigation 2.5 years ago and unearthed a large number of cases of individuals who are involved in corruption. And the decision was made to bring these people in for questioning and to confront them with the evidence and to deal with this issue in a very resolute manner. A sizable percentage of our budget, we discovered, was being stolen. And this cannot stand. Where you have corruption, you cannot have justice, you cannot have investment, you cannot have efficient and transparent government. I believe that the international community will be very, very pleased that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is not only transparent, not only firm, but has actually taken decisive action against individuals who robbed public goods. And the reason the names have not been announced is under our legal system, we don't publicize names until after the verdicts are out. And this process is still ongoing. The questioning is ongoing. The individuals will have trials in accordance with our laws, just like everybody else, and they will be held accountable. So this is a hugely important step for Saudi Arabia. Now foreign investors can come in Saudi Arabia and compete on an equal footing with everybody else. The bottom line is money was stolen from the public treasury, and that robbed the country of the ability to invest it for the good of its people. And so, of course, people have to return the funds that were stolen.
Oh my God, I've been laughing hysterically at this. I mean, the pander. Oh, okay, where to begin? Okay. So, number one, the royal family is a theft. They've been robbing that country blind. They even went so far as to name it after themselves. Like, the House of Saud has been the royal family. They've been taking the money. So, I mean, to say like, oh, misappropriated funds from the public treasury. I mean, these people have been houses all in New York and London. I mean, give me a break.
Well, Bandar bought a whole village in the UK, in the Cotswolds.
I mean, to start talking about, absconded with public funds, they have to give the money back because this is about people stealing, stealing our cut? It's kind of like that movie.
I mean, I agree with the guy. It's just, I don't know how they're going to, there's not going to be any royal family left, right? If they crack down on the corruption.
No, they're not cracking down. No, they're taking their cut. Yeah. That's what's happening. They're taking their cut. They want their cut. For people who don't understand the larger dynamic, Saudi Arabia is having an economic problem because oil prices have stayed low for a long time, and bribing the citizens with stipends and other things is part of the stability strategy, and making peace with Wahhabist clerics. So there's less money to go around, and these people and these royals have accustomed themselves to a ridiculously lavish lifestyle. All of them, they're out in Monaco. They're out. I mean, like the idea that it's so patently ridiculous, and that's also kind of why he, pirouetted into, foreign investors can come in now because we've cleaned it up. Like, we've cleaned up the corruption. You can invest your money, and we won't steal it now.
Well, I think
give me a break.
That's a key. I think that's why I wanted to hear their perspective. There are nuggets in there that give you a clue. I mean, they're trying to put together this Aramco IPO. And yeah, let's talk about the Aramco IPO because I have some stuff on that. Let's talk about that in a little bit. Let's just get through the timeline so we can, create this framework. So it's all under the pretext of it's a corruption crackdown, and there's not a lot of transparency. So we know that a lot of people have been detained. A lot more than that have been interrogated. A Middle East Eye came out with a pretty good article today saying that the number that we've been working with is 60. Like 60 people have been detained. They're saying the number is much larger than that. And there are also people who've been interrogated, maybe not necessarily detained, but they've been interrogated. And that number could be as large as 500 to 1,000. And also, we don't know many of the identities. That's been sort of leaking out over time. But even so, there's only a few names that we really know. The most prominent one of the first name that came out was Al-Wali bin Talal, who's a very Western-oriented Saudi prince, and also second or third biggest shareholder in Twitter.
Well, he doesn't have anything now.
Well, no, because the other thing they did is they have frozen about 1,800 personal bank accounts. I think that's just in their own banks. Like, I don't know if they were able to issue a freeze on, some of these, what do they call places where you offshore your money? Havens. Havens, financial havens. So anyway, that was for one of the first names that came out. Now, Middle East Eye came out today and said that and this is what I've been wondering for a week, that Prince Bandar has been detained too. And then there was a helicopter crash. Some ministers and a prince were killed in that. And then another prince was killed during the process of detaining him. A gunfight broke out and he was killed. At least that's the story that we've been told. So you have all this going on last weekend. It was just crazy. And it's been ongoing this week. I don't think that it's over yet. And then the people in Lebanon, well, at least the ones I've heard from, they don't even think that Hariri wrote that resignation speech. He said there's some, dialect type issues that you could recognize if a Lebanese person wrote it or a Saudi person. So, and the Saudis really don't want this to appear as if Hariri is being held against his will. But one story came out that said Western diplomats said he was being held, but then today, Tillerson said he wasn't. So he's, I guess, whatever. I'll just leave it at that. So the other big event that happened that day that contributes to to getting what the whole picture is here is that the Saudis announced that they had intercepted a ballistic missile that had been fired at them, and they shot it down near an international airport in Riyadh, which would have been, a high value. That would have been a big target, a big problem if they had hit that. And this has happened before. This happened back in July. The Houthis have a missile program. I mean, it's hard to understand how they do, but you have to remember that the Houthis in Yemen are allied with the former president of Yemen and, a large portion of the Yemeni military. And they do have a stock of missiles. They've had it for, since the 70s, I think. But anyway, they have some type of a program where they are modifying Scud missiles, updating them, extending their range, and they can hit Saudi Arabia. I mean, this is well known. They have been doing this for a while.
They have already hit Saudi Arabia. Wait a minute.
Yeah.
This sounds like this is the first I've ever heard of this. They've already hit Saudi Arabia. You're saying?
Oh yeah.
Not just this missile attack.
Yeah, they have these missiles called the Birkin 2 or the Volcano. It's a Scud variant, and these are old Scuds. These are old weapons from decades ago. But they obviously they do things to it. Maybe they get new parts. Maybe they redesign. Obviously, they do redesign it, and they have been working on extending the range of them. And the facility is so well hidden. It's so far underground or inside a mountain that the Saudis, no matter how much bombing they've done, and they've done a lot for 2 years, right? 2 years now. More than 2 years. I think they started in May.
With U.S. assistance, that's like they have intelligence and they have good targeting capability.
They can't do it without our military. That's right.
In-flight refueling.
So this time, the Saudis threatened. They blamed it on Iran. They said this missile came from Iran, and the same Saudi foreign minister. I'll play for you what he said about it.
The missile was Iranian-built. It is similar to a missile that was launched against the city of Yanbu on the 22nd of July. It's a Qayyim missile, has a range of over 900 kilometers. It was smuggled into Yemen in parts and then assembled in Yemen, we believe, by Revolutionary Guards and Hezbollah experts. And then it was launched at our city. We believe that the missile that landed in Riyadh is of a similar make, and we hold Iran responsible for this. They're the ones who provided the missiles in violation of UN Security Council Resolution 2216. We believe that it was Iranian experts and Hezbollah experts who taught and coordinated the attack against Saudi Arabia. So we believe that this could be considered an act of war.
So they call it an act of war.
Oh, this is by Iran.
Yeah.
Well, here's the real question. I mean, they've been accusing Iran of supporting the Houthis. They've been accusing Iran. They've called Iranian efforts an act of war. What? And by the way, I love the Saudis invoking the UN when they're committing war crimes in Yemen.
Yeah.
But I mean, breaking every international law. But like, what actually? I think there's a real question of what would happen if Saudi Arabia actually gets this war, because the Saudi Arabian military, as far as I can tell from the news reports and analysis, is kind of a joke. And while they can, go around smacking weaker countries like Yemen who don't really have the means to fight back, Iran is a pretty major military power, and it is not exactly clear to me that this is a fight, a general war or a total war between those two countries, one that Saudi Arabia would prevail in. I don't, Saudi Arabia is kind of this. It's funny, John McCain called Russia a gas station posing as a country. That is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is a gas station posing as a country. It's just this huge royal family getting smaller by the day. And in the small population, most of the people who work the country are immigrants who get treated like garbage by the Saudis. And there's really not, and while they've spent billions on military equipment, they're not really much for the fighting, which is something that, this is actually, by the way, a point of contention between Osama bin Laden and the Saudi royal family during the 1991 Gulf War, was when bin Laden said, let me lead my forces to defend Saudi Arabia, which of course was a little ridiculous, the Mujahideen, or what became Al-Qaeda. And the Saudis said, no, we're going to call on the Americans. And bin Laden said, wait a minute, you've been spending billions of dollars, tens of billions, on this military, and now you're not even going to use it? You're going to call in the Americans? And that's actually won him a lot of praise within Saudi society, who said, wait a minute, we're taking a big cut of our GDP, and they just signed another deal with Trump. A big cut of our GDP is going into military weapons. We don't know how to use them. So I'm not so sure. A war with Iran would actually be a great thing for the Saudis, for it to actually happen. Posturing and getting influence from posturing and saber rattling and smacking Qatar and smacking Lebanon now and smacking Yemen is one thing, but to actually go toe-to-toe with Iran, I wonder if that's going to end so well for Saudi.
Yeah, it's a show military mainly. I think they allow the royals to become pilots and or at least they become people of status. But yeah, they can't. I know they can't do this air war in Yemen without the assistance of the U.S. So we've got, I think, 2,000 people over there who help them run their air force and their military, things like that. But anyway, yeah. And I mean, we have they already have a proxy war right now in Syria with Iran, right? At least in part, that's what the Syrian war is. And it didn't go well. The war in Yemen is a big embarrassment for them. They have this country completely blockaded. It has no air force. The Houthis themselves, I mean, they're like barefoot sandal fighters. And but they're really good fighters. But they're defending their home, so.
Well, but like look at the Syrian example with Saudi Arabia. They they didn't put in troops. They're not like Turkey. Turkey has a military. Turkey has I mean, not a great military, but it has a military that it can send in and enforce, or at least play a role, not necessarily enforce its will, but try to and have some influence. Whereas the Saudi military can't go in there. They're just paying these jihadists. They're basically paying. They're like this big rich, this big rich fat cat who's simply trying to pay people to go fight wars for them. I think it's instructive to see that Saudi Arabia hasn't put any boots on the ground despite all its posturing in Syria, because it would probably get obliterated.
Well, if you look at the situation in Yemen, for the first at least 6 months to a year, they try to scare up ground forces. It seems to always be their problem is effective ground forces. I mean, they don't have a very effective military of their own other than their palace guard, because they fear them rising up against them. So they have this dilemma, Also,
you're saying, wait a minute, just to clarify your point there, you're saying the Saudi Arabia won't build a large troop force because they're afraid the royal family is afraid that if they built such a mechanism, it could create a rival power within the Saudi political system that might ultimately overthrow.
Throw their asses out of the palace. I mean, that's what they're afraid of.
It's not a ridiculous fear.
An army of common men. And they have that whole issue of a large part of the population is in the eastern part of the country on the Gulf, and they're Shia. And that's where most of the oil operations are too. And they're not too fond of the Wahhabi royal family. So, it's already a population they have to suppress. But in Yemen, it was very interesting to watch because in the past, they have been able to call on Egypt. Egypt had a strong army, has always had a strong army. And Egypt went into Yemen once before, like I guess 30 years ago. And there's still, burned out Egyptian military vehicles along the roads there in Yemen. It didn't go very well for Egypt, and they refused to go back, even though they're very much reliant on Saudi Arabia for money and other kinds of support. They said no. Sisi said no. And then they ordered the United Arab Emirates troops to come in, and they did. So they were there for a while. But I don't want to get into the whole thing with Yemen war, but they did answer the call for a while. But then at one point, I remember seeing a whole convoy of military vehicles returning back to the United Arab Emirates. They weren't too happy with that, playing that role either. They called on Pakistan to send troops, and I think Pakistan sort of toyed with them for a while and then said no. So they rely on mercenaries. They brought mercenaries from Colombia to go and fight in Yemen.
Colombia is fighting in Yemen?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that the Saudis hired some Colombian mercenaries.
Oh, so okay, mercenaries, not the Colombian nation of Colombia has not agreed to join the war crimes of Yemen. That would be crazy.
Emiratis secretly sends Colombian mercenaries to Yemen to fight. Yeah, that was early on. That was like November 15th. I'm sorry. Yeah, in November 2015. I think the war in Yemen started in the spring of 2015. So it's more than 2 years now. And it's getting to the point where it's like genocide now. There's so many people have been killed and they're blockaded. So they're not only starving them, but they're withholding all kinds of things like medicine. And they have a epidemic now. Cholera. Yes, cholera. And it's just growing and growing exponentially. I think now it's almost 1 million people. So it's an atrocity. It always has been an atrocity what they've been doing in Yemen, but it's now on such a large scale that it's shocking, really, that they can keep going like this.
No, they can keep going because the U.S. is helping them do it. This started under the Obama administration, let us not forget. And there's just Yemen just doesn't have any powerful friends, and the Saudis do because of their money. And the U.S. is participating. By the way, this happened during the Obama administration. There were discussions within the Obama administration when they were refueling flights and picking targets, when they said, we are engaged in war crimes. And we better try to distance ourselves from this because we can get called in when all the dust settles and the bodies are buried and there's some sort of international legal accounting. We really don't want to get too close to this. And that was the Obama administration's dialogue about this. I guess the Trump administration has basically said we don't care, but even the people who started this U.S. involvement in this genocide or killing or whatever you want to call it were worried that they were participating in something that was clearly against international law.
Right. I saw something today, by the way, that there's some activity in the ICC, the International Criminal Court, that could end up coming after us.
Or we're not signatories. They can't do anything, right?
I'm not an expert on that, so I really don't know.
Well, the reason that we wouldn't sign it. This was during this big debate. I remember this during the Clinton years. The reason we wouldn't sign it is because if we signed it, we would almost certainly be prosecuted either for crimes that we had committed presently, because there was bombing going on in Eastern Europe that wasn't clear that we were following international law, or clearly in the future. And in fact, when you hear something funny, members of Congress said if we signed the treaty for the International Criminal Court, they would pass a law that said in the event that an American military officer was extradited to Brussels or was arrested in Europe or somewhere that's an ICC signatory, it would be the duty of the U.S. president to launch forces and liberate them from Brussels. This is true.
And commit some more war crimes.
Well, but I mean, like, they're going to invade Brussels.
Yeah.
This was going to be U.S. law if we signed the ICC. Now we didn't, which is good news for George W. Bush, as we didn't. So we're not subject to it, and you only can be subject to it if you sign the treaty.
Yeah, I'm not sure if there are ways to. I'm not sure if there is still a way to go after people, even if their country's not a signatory. Like if they can go after individuals, I'm not quite sure.
Maybe like foreign bank accounts or something. I don't know.
So not to dig into that too much, but yeah. So Yemen, and pinning it on Iran, and then they actually tied Hezbollah in there too. They said that the missile parts came from Iran, that they were broken up in pieces, and that Hezbollah was in Yemen assembling them.
How would they even know that? Does anybody trust Saudi intelligence? They can't even hit their targets. Then the U.S. supplied that intelligence? Who supplied the Saudis with that intelligence? Because the Saudis certainly wouldn't have gotten it on their own if it's true. And I really doubt it's true.
I don't know if they revealed where they got it. So I know that the Jane's Defense Weekly has assessed it as the same thing that they've been assessing all along, which is modified Scud missiles from a Yemeni, missile program that they still have. They did mention
it should be noted that they shot it down. Would they have been able to shoot down a high-tech missile? No, it was much more likely they would have shot down a Scud, which the Patriot missile system, well, it's a question of how effective it was, but the Patriot missile system was designed to shoot down Scuds in the 90s. So I would believe, actually, that they were able to hit a Scud. I don't believe that if Iran put in a specially built missile, they would have hit it so easily.
I mean, it's even been suggested that they launched it themselves and shot it down themselves as part of the. You have to remember the bigger picture of everything else that was going on at the time. That could have been just part of this scenario that they were creating. So anyway, that's all happening at the same time. And then on November 7th, and this I found very interesting, a journalist from Israeli Channel 10, and there aren't that many channels in Israel, leaked a diplomatic cable that had been sent out to all of Israel's embassies with a démarche or whatever, an order, which is a strong urging to the governments in those countries to ramp up the pressure on Hezbollah and Iran. And I saw it on Twitter when it came out. And then there were some people from, say, Brookings and some other think tanks who were clearly agreed with what this, saying what a big leak it was. And they were agreeing with it and saying, they weren't happy with the way the Saudis were carrying this whole thing out. So that was on the 7th, and it's early this morning. Israeli Channel 10 News published a leaked diplomatic cable, which had been sent to all Israeli ambassadors throughout the world concerning the chaotic events that unfolded over the weekend in Lebanon and Saudi Arabia, which began with Lebanese Prime Minister Saad Hariri's unexpected resignation after he was summoned to Riyadh by his Saudi backers, and led to the Saudis announcing that Lebanon had declared war against the kingdom. The classified embassy cable, written in Hebrew, constitutes the first formal evidence proving that the Saudis and Israelis are deliberately coordinating to escalate the situation in the Middle East. The explosive classified Israeli cable reveals the following. On Sunday, just after Lebanese Prime Minister Hariri's shocking resignation, Israel sent a cable to all of its embassies with the request that its diplomats do everything possible to ramp up diplomatic pressure against Hezbollah and Iran. The cable stressed that Iran was engaged in regional subversion Israeli diplomats were urged to appeal to the highest officials within their host countries to attempt to expel Hezbollah from Lebanese government and politics. So this was a big deal. And what else do we have on this timeline? We have on November 9th, a New York Times reporter said that Western diplomats who visited Hariri in Saudi Arabia believe he's being held against his will. And he subsequently did leave Saudi Arabia, but he went to the United Arab Emirates. He went to
That's not leaving Saudi Arabia. That's not even leaving Saudi airspace.
Yeah, it's like going from the living room to the balcony, someone said. It's really...
Yeah, and the UAE is totally in Saudi Arabia. We should note that, by the way. The UAE is totally in Saudi Arabia's pocket. They are essentially lapdogs for the Saudis. I mean, to a degree that's kind of embarrassing. So going to UAE is not leaving Saudi Arabia. That's like, saying you leave it. Yeah, right. From the living room to the balcony. That's right. Haven't left the house.
Back to Hariri for a second. He did leave Saudi Arabia, but he went to the United Arab Emirates, and then he was supposed to return to Lebanon, but then that didn't happen.
I guess they don't have the talking points down yet. Like, why did you leave? Why did you? I mean, he's got to explain himself.
Well, he did. I mean, he slammed Iran. But the thing is, it wasn't very convincing.
Going to work on his performance in method acting in UAE.
Yeah. So, and then, everyone was afraid that this meant that Israel would advance on Lebanon again. That's a constant tension, right? You never know when the next Hezbollah-Israel war will happen. Then Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, then they told all their citizens to leave Lebanon, which, gave more of an impression that there was going to be some war, but who would go into Lebanon other than the Israeli military? Who, I mean, they would love to do that again, but they're not stupid.
I mean, not the Saudis can't go in. And
are they going to take that risk? I mean, they're not, but they've been really in a state of anxiety over the fact that Iran and Hezbollah fighting forces are in Syria right next door, and Netanyahu said that they can't stay. They lobbied the United States to try to get them out of Syria. But they just did not win this war. And frankly, they brought it upon themselves by being one of the Assad must go parties. So then today, Nasrallah, who's Hezbollah's spiritual or political leader, because Hezbollah is also a political party. Hezbollah holds a significant number of seats in the Lebanese parliament. And the Lebanese government, I mean, that's too complicated to get into for this episode. We just have to assume that people know something about it. I guess we don't have to go into that's a whole episode of its own.
Yeah, that's a whole thing. We'll have to interview someone who knows the inner workings of the politics of Lebanon. But needless to say, Hezbollah is not just a military force; they're a political force, and they control territory. They're like They have
and parliament. They're elected.
Right, they have, right.
So, that's a big problem because basically what Saudi Arabia and Israel are saying is, Hezbollah cannot be in any position of influence or authority in that country. We won't stand for it. And, Lebanese people are kind of like, well, yeah, it's not quite that simple. They have a lot of support, frankly. And they have elected positions in government, and they have they cooperate on certain things.
And they're Lebanese people. They're actually like the Lebanese people.
That too. Yeah, so we have that. So then another interesting thing was that it wasn't clear. Most people felt that the Saudis would never have done any of these things unless they had a wink and a nod from Trump. And it's pretty clear that either they had his go-ahead of time, or if they didn't, he came out and supported them on Twitter and said, "Oh, these guys know what they're doing," and which made everyone think for a minute, I think it means the opposite. They don't know what they're doing. So anyway, and Jared, I forgot an important part. Jared Kushner had just spent some few days meeting with Prince Reckless right before this happened. So it was pretty clear that if he didn't help plan it, then he certainly was briefed on it. He knew what was going on.
Let's be 100% on this before this,
Well, I was being
to
generous.
alleviate any confusion. No, to alleviate any confusion. The Saudi would never do. They would never do the reform, quote unquote. They would never do anything with Lebanon unless they got an okay from the United States. Let's be they don't go rogue. This is a very integrated partnership, military and otherwise. And not only that, I mean, Trump supported the Saudis when they blockaded Qatar, where the U.S. has the largest military base in the Middle East. He sided with the people blockading the country that was hosting the largest U.S. military base in the region. So that should tell you these people are in complete cahoots. So the fact that Jared Kushner, the everyman diplomat whose portfolio keeps expanding, peace in the Middle East. I don't know what else he's in charge. Oh, peace in the Middle East, modernizing the technology of the federal government. I mean, he's got this ridiculously long portfolio. So, yeah, this happened with an okay. I'm not saying that the U.S. agreed to every little part of it, or they totally are in line with the agenda of the Salman regime or whoever's taken over Saudi Arabia, but they definitely got a heads up.
Well, the interesting part of this is that I've seen it phrased as that the Trump administration sidelined the Pentagon and the State Department on this, which I found very hard to believe. But Tillerson, who is, I forget where he is, but he issued a formal statement on the State Department website, and he said that Hariri is a strong partner of the United States, and he warned all parties not to destabilize Lebanon or use it for a proxy conflict. And yeah.
Too late.
Yeah. And what's also interesting, though, is that, he brought up Qatar, the great dispute between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, who wants Qatar to come to heel, and they want them to be a vassal. And Qatar's like, hell no. And that's still sort of on a standoff. But I started to believe that Trump did this without the go-ahead from the Pentagon or the State Department. Certainly it indicates that the State Department is not on board. So anyway, here's Tillerson's press statement. He says, the United States strongly supports the sovereignty and independence of the Republic of Lebanon and all of its political institutions. The United States urges all parties, both within Lebanon and outside, to respect the integrity and independence of Lebanon's legitimate national institutions, including the government of Lebanon and the Lebanese armed forces. In this regard, we respect the Lebanese Prime Minister, Saad al-Hariri, as a strong partner of the United States. Notice
is this after he resigned?
Tense. That's present tense, right?
Well, but when was this issued? Was this issued after his formal resignation?
Today.
Wait a minute. I thought this guy resigned, so Tillerson's not recognizing the resignation either?
Today, November 10th, 2017. And he refers to Hariri as in the present tense as the prime minister, which says the State Department doesn't recognize that resignation, right? So that's interesting in itself. And then he goes on to say, the United States supports the stability of Lebanon and is opposed to any actions that could threaten that stability. There is no legitimate place or role in Lebanon for any foreign forces, militias, or armed elements other than the legitimate security forces of the Lebanese state, which must be recognized as the sole authority for security in Lebanon.
But that's directed at Hezbollah. That's not directed at the Saudis. The
Yeah,
foreign menace in this scenario is Hezbollah, and that's what he means when I don't think that's directed at Saudi Arabia. I think that's
listen to the last sentence. The United States cautions against any party within or outside Lebanon using Lebanon as a venue for proxy conflicts or in any manner contributing to instability in that country. That's not just Hezbollah. That's
Iran. maybe the Saudis too, though.
It's
Maybe the
Iran.
Saudis.
Yeah, I think.
It's pretty open ended. Yeah, it could be. It could be seen that way. It could be a shot across the bow at the Saudis. Like, all right.
I do
But then
think
again, they're not negotiating with Tillerson. They're negotiating with Trump. and Tillerson famously called Trump a, quote, fucking moron, unquote. So it's not clear that the State Department is actually running foreign policy at this point.
Well, technically, he denied that. I don't doubt that it could have happened, but technically, we don't really know that.
Did he formally deny that?
And
okay. That maybe what didn't happen then.
And journalists, I don't know if you've noticed, but journalists on Twitter have been like just making things up, just fabricating.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
And then it gets retweeted thousands of times.
Right.
Sometimes they come back because they're just
that one rang true for me. That one rang true for me. But you're right. It's
well, yeah. I could believe it too for sure. But I pretty much shut anything sort of inflammatory like that that's supposed to blow it off now because there's just no way to tell whether it's true or not. You got about a 50-50 chance.
Well, here's the two scenarios with Tillerson. Either Trump and him are playing a very sophisticated good cop, bad cop game, or Trump is going rogue all the time and not putting Tillerson in the loop. Which do you think is more probable?
Well, I went looking I thought, well, yeah, maybe he just blew off the State Department. That really wouldn't surprise me, but it would really surprise me if he blew off the military. However, so I went looking for a statement from Mattis, because Mattis is over at NATO confabbing with the Europeans about the great menace Russia on their, yeah. So what do they say? Russia, how dare you put your country so close to our military bases? So anyway, now I lost my train of thought.
So you're saying there was no statement from the Department of Defense?
Oh yeah. So I thought, well, Mattis, Trump's all about his generals, right? Mattis was asked as far as I can tell in the transcripts that is on the Pentagon website, he was asked about it once and chose not to answer any questions about it because he used some excuse. But I did remember the situation with Qatar. If you recall, Trump voiced support for the Saudis, right, when they tried to crack down on Qatar?
Yes.
He did. However, the military did not.
They have the huge base there.
Yeah, they have a huge, important base there. And I'm not sure of why else, what other reasons the military might have for not wanting anyone to mess with Qatar. But they pushed back. They pushed back on that. So that would be a case of Trump taking a position or taking an action that the military would strongly disagree with and in the end, kind of override. So I guess this is possible that he sent Kushner over there and that they, planned this. This people calling it the Purge. The Purge, it's hard to believe that they would do something like this on short notice. But on the other hand, it doesn't seem to be particularly well planned either. So I guess at some point in time, we might learn about that. Is what, the lead up to this. The Saudi foreign minister, not that I believe 99% of what the guy said, but he did say that when the Salman, the father, the king, came into, that a prosecutor has been doing an investigation, for 2.5 years, which is, I think, right about the same amount of time that Salman's been on that throne. So anyway, that's what Tillerson said today. He may have been just appeasing Saudi Arabia and Israel, if this is taken to be mostly aimed at Hezbollah, but I don't think you can deny that it's also a warning to all parties. It's a
warning, but what's going to happen what's going to actually happen? A warning has to have some teeth. This is the problem with having this divided system is Tillerson says some stuff and then the countries go, yeah, but what does Trump think? It's so dislocating that so Saudi Arabia hears this from Tillerson and goes, whatever. Jared told us it's good.
Yeah, and often Nikki Haley just sort of completely
contradicts. She's just keeping her head down. This is a resume line for her. She's just keeping her head down. She's trying to she's trying to not get embarrassed by being in the Trump administration while also using it as a stepping stone to further her political career, which I guess of all the people involved is somewhat rational. But yeah, she's just keeping her head down. She's not going to stop the Trump. She's just trying to be like, no, I served in a Republican administration.
She seems very much like just a parrot. She's a parrot for the neocon line.
Yeah.
There's not a whole lot of difference between her and Samantha Power, really, and the kind of things they say.
Well, of course not.
But it has been noticeable when, Tillerson had, like with Syria, the biggest example I can think of, though I've seen it more than once, about a week before we launched missiles in Syria, the great chocolate cake missiles, Tillerson had said that he had made a statement that sort of backing down on the Assad must go, and a more peaceful statement anyway, that looked like we were advancing towards some kind of an agreement. And like a week later, we're launching missiles. So there's how much stock you put in.
Yeah, I wouldn't put much stock in what Tillerson. I mean, I'm not saying what he says isn't worth noting. It's just he's not the decider. He's not the commander-in-chief, and the commander-in-chief he works for doesn't. See, this is the thing about Trump is, unlike a usual administration, there's a line created at the White House, and if you see a cabinet secretary say something, hey, that's the White House's line. That's been cleared by the White House communications director and office. This isn't really a message from Trump. But with this administration, you don't know who the hell cleared what and if it's completely not what the president wants to do. So I think you should know what Tillerson says. It's always relevant what the Secretary of State says, but it's not necessarily policy. Right? Which is a problem if you're trying to figure out, if you're around the world and you're a foreign leader trying to figure out how the hell to play the game, and you see and you hear a message from the Secretary of State previously meant, oh, that's what President Obama thinks, or oh, that's what President Bush thinks. Now it's like, oh, well, that's what Tillerson thinks. I wonder what Trump thinks.
So maybe Trump blew off the State Department, but did he, quote unquote, sideline the Pentagon? So we don't really have any indication from that as yet. But today I noticed this, which seemed pretty significant. A U.S. Air Force Lieutenant General Harrington was at the Dubai Air Show today. And he said the Houthi missiles, they bore, quote unquote, Iranian markings. And he said, there have been Iranian markings on those missiles. To me, that connects the dots to Iran. So the fact that he took that stance, maybe it was an off the cuff comment. I mean, we'll see if more U.S. military take that stance, but that's a bit concerning. I mean, I guess it's possible that it's true.
Possible the Saudis put them on there after it hit the ground.
Yeah, but I mean, there's also been talk about there are parts from North Korea on these modified missiles, which is...
Oh, how do we can rope in the entire axis of evil. Maybe Iraq had some... Oh, wait, they're good now.
Yeah. The whole sideline comment here, Ali Soufan on Twitter he said, lots of chaos since President Trump and Jared Kushner curiously sidelined state and the Pentagon and emboldened Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Leaked documents expose a stunning plan to wage financial war on Qatar and steal the World Cup. So he's talking about an article in The Intercept, which I am, by the way, grain of salt with pretty much everything that comes from The Intercept right now, in my view, whereas I would have given it a high credibility rating, but a number of things have happened that we'll talk about some other time. But anyway, this is Ryan Grimm. I mean, good enough journalist, but I only know him as a TYT guy who's like a Washington bureau. I never have known him to be an expert on the topics that are covered by this article, which are both
he's not
sort of high finance,
Huffington Post guy,
high finance, and some intricate Middle East foreign policy. Neither of which have I known to be his specialty. But in any case, I think he's been doing some work on this because I saw an interview with him, and he basically was talking about all the money that flows from the Gulf states into think tanks in Washington, which was a pretty interesting topic that we actually did an episode on that with Ken Silverstein. But the thing is that what they found, if you recall, The Intercept has some emails from an Emirati, the ambassador to the United States, Yusuf Al-Taiba. Remember, there were some emails that were leaked to them, and they published some things from it. Well, it turns out they also have apparently his whole Outlook, all the files from, including his to-do list, his task list. And in that, and I guess they have information from a group called Global Leaks, which I haven't looked into that so much anymore, but they have the actual, task list of a plan to wage economic warfare, to manipulate the bond market and do a number of other things to basically cause Qatar to drain all of their reserves. So anyway, that was just an interesting side note. And then one other thing from Trita Parsi, an analyst expert on Iran. He said, U.S. government source tells me Washington is not involved in Saudi Arabia's campaign against Lebanon or its preparation for war. Trump's getting completely played by Saudi. So, yeah, two pretty insightful guys just throwing in what information they've talked about lately. There's a lot more. But I think the last thing that I don't hear a lot about in all the analysis, I hear a lot of, palace intrigue. And something like this did happen in 1964 when one king ousted another. But since then, it has not happened. There's been, some sort of agreements among the families. There's been at least some measure of unity. But in this Middle East Eye article, and I'll post links to these in the show notes, they were the first to report the Prince Bandars among the detained, and also Bakr bin Laden, and that is the head of the Bin Laden construction company, right? Massive company. Well, he's been detained too, and we heard the foreign minister say that they're going to take the money from the people whoever their prosecutor per se finds guilty. They intend to seize their assets. And what's it called when you take things back? So I don't know what's going to happen. Yeah. And then they say the sons of all four key men in the House of Saud who comprise the core of the family through the last 4 decades have been targeted. They are the sons of King Fahd bin Abdulaziz, King Abdullah, Prince Sultan, and Prince Naif. This represents an unprecedented attack on the position and wealth of the pillars of Al Saud, including the 3 most prominent figures of the ruling Sudari clan. And then I note to myself that Abdullah, the former king of Saudi Arabia, it's reported that he intended to write Solomon out of the line of succession, but then he died before he could get around to doing that. So this particular branch of the family was never supposed to take the throne, but they've got it now, and
it's payback time.
But the other question, other than wondering what happened to Bandar, I was curious about this guy who's really gotten the most reporting in all this, the Al-Wali bin Talal, the guy who owns a big stake in Twitter, Citibank, very westernized. And I thought, what did this guy do to get pulled in like that? Or what has he said lately? And as it turns out, about a week or 10 days, as I mentioned before,
he fought with Trump, right?
He gave an interview, a long interview with CNBC as well. And I thought, okay, well, what did he say? Did he say something? Well, mainly what he talked about, he did talk some about Iran, and he talked a little bit about the geopolitics, and that he said that Saudis are very active in the Middle East, and they're basically trying to neutralize Iraq. They're trying to stop lessen or eliminate the influence of Iran on Iraq, and that they're working on that with the United States, he said. But they were talking mostly about Aramco, right? So, like you mentioned, Saudi Arabia, because of the drop in the price of oil, they just sort of kept their same lifestyle and spending level for a long time, and they drained their reserves. From what I've heard, their reserves are about half of what they once were. So they have a legitimate financial crisis. They also have a plan to modernize. And, a big decision that was made not too long ago was that they're actually going to privatize the Saudi oil, which is Aramco. So it's a company.
IPO. There's talk about an IPO.
So they're trying to pull together an IPO. And one thing that Awali talked about in CNBC was the fact that China might invest in this company. Let me just play this clip of what he said.
$2 trillion. Now, clearly, if you go public with 5%, that's going to get $100 billion. I'm full support to that. I'm in full support of the IPO of Aramco, because this is another safety valve for Saudi Arabia that the money could be used as needed.
The CEO said that the Chinese are not, or at least that he's not talking to the Chinese. Is it possible that the Chinese could be talking to the government?
Yeah. Well, I'm not a member of the government, but I read these reports, and I would not be surprised if China will be looking at this opportunity, because China depends on oil and will depend on oil for a long time to come. And Saudi Arabia is an anchor exporter of oil to China. So if this thing happens, it should be very much welcomed. And I heard a lot of discussion in the Western media that if China comes and buy X percentage of Saudi Aramco, this may hinder and delay the projected IPO of Aramco. This is not the case, because all companies in the world, and Aramco is a company, by the way, is they can have an anchor investor before going IPO. Actually, if Chinese come or any other investor come and invest in Aramco pre-IPO, that even should confirm and expedite the process of having Aramco go public, because this will rubber stamp the price that Aramco is, that the owners of Aramco, which is the Saudi government, is seeking.
So there's this issue of how much of a stake in Aramco China might take. There's also some talk about, since this is only 5%, that they could also, and Al-Walid mentions, we can start out with this 5%. But we can also sell another 5% next year, and in other words, that more could be sold off. And there was talk of that China wants to directly buy a piece of Aramco. And I just wondered, is that a source of, this Aramco thing is very, very critical to the survival of this country, right? But it's controversial. So I don't know. I was just wondering what you thought about that.
Well, I think that, there is an attempt to box China out in Saudi Arabia for sure. I wonder with that particular Talib, is it?
Al-Walid bin Talal.
He had been in a Twitter feud with Trump. They hate each other, and I wonder if that helped bring him down. Which, as trivial as it sounds, the Saudis are they have a monarchy, and they kind of look at the president like a king. And the fact that this guy's insulting the president of the United States, who is very vital to the future of Saudi Arabia, I wonder if there's a calculus done, and they're very calculating. Clearly, the Salman clan is very calculating, given how they've pulled this off. I wonder if they thought that might have been a sweetener to make Trump go along with this palace coup. So we're going to take out this guy who's been insulting you. And Trump also, by the way, publicly tweeted about how he wanted the Aramco IPO to be done with the United States. So it's that I think Aramco's in this. I think personal feuds are in this. I think this is a palace coup in every sense, not just with the people who precipitated it, but the Donald Trump and the Trump royal family of the United States, who has their own interests in Saudi Arabia and has their own little enemies. So I would not be surprised if that Twitter feud helped bring him down, as funny as that is, or as odd as that is.
Yeah. I listened to the whole interview, and I saw no real indication, other than the China issue, And even that, I'm not quite sure if that's a point of contention, a bone of contention with Prince Reckless. And that's high. But other than that, I couldn't see anything in it. He was enthusiastic about the Vision 2030, or the Saudi plan to completely modernize the country. He was in full support of that. He did talk about, how there are disagreements about how much of Aramco to sell and in what way. But I mean, he didn't say anything controversial. He was, he showed deference to the king and Reckless. And it's funny because the guy on CNBC asked him about that. He said, before the election, you and President Trump didn't get along very well, did you? And he completely reversed that. And he flattered, which I guess he expected.
Not enough.
But he actually went a little further than to just, sort of from some fake flattery. Because this guy, he's really not like most of the other Saudis I've seen speak. He's much more spontaneous, much more westernized. And he's like, he's like up there with, like, he works with Bill Gates a lot. And he also
not anymore.
Well, here's an interesting thing. He talked about how he's, into philanthropy. And he signed on to that, whatever that pledge was. I'm going to give away half my money to charity. These billionaires who, they continue to be billionaires while they're alive, but
he is the charity of the Saudi royal family.
They pledge to give away most of their wealth, and
he's a douchebag. He emulates the Western douchebag set, but I think that probably hurt him with the Saudis that he was so Westernish.
Well, since they're pulling back all the funds that they can because their reserves have been cut in half, and they continue to drain them every day. The war in Yemen cost something like ridiculous hundreds of millions of dollars, and is apparently not popular at home for that reason, because they're, they tried to cut the entitlements. They tried to apply some more taxes and fees, and I believe they had to roll that back because it, obviously didn't go over very well, but they feared.
But either way, the reason they went after him is, one, yes, he's pissed off Trump. Yes, but number one is he's got a lot of money and they want it.
Yeah.
That's the real reason this guy is getting pounded right now or imprisoned or whatever the hell they're doing. It's a clawback. They want that money. They need it. The fact that he was in a feud with Trump only made it easier. The fact that he's not considered a real devout Muslim, which of course you apply that to a lot of royal family members, is another reason. The fact that he's so Western and he said he was going to give the money away rather than keep it in the family. There's a million good reasons, but I think the number one reason this guy was targeted is because he's got a lot of money and they want it.
It does. I mean, I don't know how you can. He claims to be still a devout Muslim.
Yeah, bullshit. So I think the big picture, big takeaway from all this as we're wrapping up here is the Iran-Saudi Arabia Cold War continues. It is expanding from Syria and Yemen into Lebanon. And they're telling their citizens to leave Lebanon. Other states are telling their citizens to leave Lebanon. This is, in my view, what's been one of the things that we haven't explored and a lot of people don't talk about, but including especially the American press, is that the Saudi-Israeli alliance. And I find it's going to be very interesting if Lebanon really does become a battlefield, another battlefield in this fucking war. These people have destroyed Syria, they've destroyed Yemen, and now they want to destroy Lebanon again. It'll be interesting to see if Israel can keep such clean hands. Israel's been a participant in the Syrian civil war. Don't get it twisted. But they've kept their hands relatively clean. I think if it jumps off in Lebanon, it's going to be very hard for Israel to stay out.
Yeah. I can't find it, but there was another. I think it was in Nasrallah's speech. He said, I have information that says Saudi Arabia offered Israel billions of dollars in exchange for bombing Hezbollah and Lebanon. Also, Saudi incitement played a major role in the 2006 war against Hezbollah. I was shocked by that, frankly. If this is true that he has this evidence, that certainly puts a different spin on it than one I had before. I would have thought that Israel was more anxious to get to Hezbollah than the Saudis, but I don't know, just an interesting little.
But even the alliance itself is a scandal within the Arab Muslim world, because these are former enemies fighting over Jerusalem, and that the Saudis, it's a liability for the Saudis, not Israel, that the Saudis are, partnering with the Zionist occupiers, quote unquote,
Abandoning the Palestinians,
abandoning Islam to work with, the Western-backed Zionists. That's a real scandal for them, and that's enough of a scandal to threaten the stability of the regime in Saudi Arabia. It's a very dangerous game, because remember, that's the one thing that all the Muslim countries do agree on, is they all hated Israel. That was the one thing that all brought them together, is they hated Israel. And there's a lot of Saudi citizens who feel that way about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So I think it's an interesting tactic. If he doesn't have I don't know if he has the evidence or not, but it's a good political tactic to paint the Saudis as in an open conspiracy with the Israelis, which, by the way, happens to be true, to kind of undermine that they've partnered with the Zionists, the real enemy. So I think that's the Hezbollah political attack, is to question the Saudis' legitimacy as Muslims, or let alone Muslim leaders who are, of course, stewards of the holy sites.
You know what else it would explain, Dan? I don't know if you think this or not, but Israel openly supports some al-Qaeda groups in Syria. There's a hospital. They provide medical treatment for them. It seems like they do some airstrikes on their behalf. When an errant shell goes over the border that damaged nothing, and then the Israeli Air Force retaliates and bombs the Syrian army in their own country. So, I don't know. That alliance sort of makes that make more sense, because it really doesn't make much sense for the Israelis to support.
Oh, sure it does. There's a great, speaking of next time, we'll have to do this because we got to wrap up here.
Yeah.
There is a clip of the former ambassador from Israel to the United States, Michael Oren, in a discussion with Jeffrey Goldberg of the Atlantic, saying, "We prefer ISIS to Iran."
Yeah.
Saying it straight up. So this is in Israel. Israel has its own policy, and its policy is to support the Sunni jihadists, because they also hate Iran. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. And they don't really much care. I mean, they've got the Palestinians essentially contained. They're slowly taking the West Bank. Gaza is just being, more and more barricaded in. So they're not that worried about jihadism anymore in their own country. And they're happy to use Sunni jihadists to hurt Iran, who they see as their only remaining threat. They're not scared of Egypt. They're not scared of the Saudis, for sure. They're scared of Iran and Hezbollah, who are the only people who defeated them in a war, which was their attempt to the Lebanese war of, God, there's been a few of them, actually. The 2006 one was kind of a disaster. There was also another one where Israel tried to occupy and didn't end too well. So they are cool with the Sunni jihadists. That's a useful force for them, and that's part of that Saudi-Israeli alliance. Now, that should be a scandal not for the Saudis. That should be a scandal for Israel, because Israel's partnered with the United States, and the people they're supporting are the people that attacked the United States on 9/11.
Right.
So there's a lot of scandal going on, and no one's really reporting on it, particularly in any of the Western press. So I think Nasrallah and Hezbollah are happy, whether they had that evidence or not. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it existed. And Hezbollah has been pretty adept at intelligence gathering. But it's more like a sort of poke in the eye, like, if you want to make this a war, let's see how many people are going to be on your side if they know that you're in cahoots with Israel.
Yeah, and it's interesting to watch Nasrallah, who, from our side and the Saudi side and the Israeli side, we declare them as a terrorist group and damaging and everything else. But Nasrallah is saying to the country, stay calm. They can't incite a war here or destabilize us if we choose not to. And it's very interesting that they expect the Sunni part of the population, they expect people to be out in the streets again and the fighting to start again. And, it remains to be seen whether they can incite what they hope to incite inside Lebanon.
It's also an interesting thing, I guess it's an interesting demonstration of how bad it's gotten for the Saudis and the Israeli interests that Hezbollah sees itself as the establishment and therefore doesn't want insurgency. And that they've partnered with the Lebanese the Sunni establishment, and that kind of, instead of being an insurgent force, stabilize things, they consider themselves to have succeeded so much that they actually don't want instability because they're the new power, which of course pisses them off even more, because the whole reason they're unhappy with Lebanon and Hariri is because he's doing business with Hezbollah, who's partnered with Iran. And the reason Hariri has to do it is because Hezbollah is so strong, he can't form a working government without dealing with Hezbollah.
And it's just that the Saudis and the Israelis, and maybe the United States to some extent, just refusing to accept what their actions have wrought. It's just, Syria did not work out the way it was supposed to. Obviously, the Iraq War didn't either. What was supposed to happen was these countries were supposed to destabilize and break up. It's been a long-term policy, and the Saudis were supposed to dominate. Weaker states, easier to dominate. And instead, what happened is Iran gained influence. Hezbollah grew. They even now have a mechanized division. They're much stronger than they were at the beginning. So, the opposite of what they intended happened, and they're not recognizing that reality.
Yeah, maybe Iran should be funding the Heritage Foundation, the American, and the Brookings. I mean, these guys did nothing but giving the Middle East over to Iranian influence. They knock out Saddam Hussein, the one bulwark, and now they've forced Assad to be totally dependent on them and opened the floodgates for Shia militia to be patrolling the streets in Syria. I mean, these guys have been great for Iranian power.
Well, what's the Middle East Institute and, the other think tanks who get all that funding from the Saudis and the Emiratis? What are they going to do now if their funders are locked up?
Oh, yeah, I guess they got an audition for the new royals, the new mandarins.
We'll have to see if Charles Lister gets laid off.
Oh, poor Charles. All right. And
Okay.
on that note, thank you for listening, and appreciate it. And if you want to follow our work, at Around the Empire on Twitter, aroundtheempire.com. You can follow Joanne on Twitter at Joanne Leon, Leon. You can follow me at US Empire Show. Questions, comments, want to yell at me, yell at us, Dan at aroundtheempire.com. Have a good one.
I also just wanted to mention, thank you for your patience. We had, as I mentioned last time, some equipment issues. We have a new schedule to deal with. And, thank you to our patrons and listeners. And we will catch up on these episodes. We have some more coming for you this week. Take care, everybody.